Hello there. Welcome, everyone. I just got my cup of tea and I'm happy. I hope all of you are well. Thank you. Right, today our usual Wednesday reading. We are reading on colonialism because I am Little Mix, always ready to ruin the vibes by talking about colonialism. How is everyone? I hope everyone is doing well. Let me just make sure that everything is fine. Yeah. Hi, Taylor. Oh my goodness, it's good to see you. It's very good to see you. It's been a while. And no, I'm not going to sing the song by Stained, even though that's what I have in my head. I haven't seen you in so long. Let's catch up after this. Let's have a chat on Discord maybe. Keep tapping the screen and sharing the live if you are on TikTok, if you are on Twitch and YouTube. Welcome. I am trying to get these platforms up and running, and welcome back to the Discord peoples, my old faithfuls on Discord. We have been here since the start. And I went through a very weird moment earlier when I opened up my Facebook memories and I saw, let me try out this this TikTok thing. That was 5 years ago today. Let me try out this TikTok thing. And here we are. Yeah. It's kind of wild that it has been 5 years for this journey that we find ourselves on. So it was a little bit emotional, realizing that the 22nd of October, it's 5 years since I joined TikTok, since I started this community, building people around the world, and being here, doing the activism, doing the reading, and sometimes it feels surreal. Right, so we're on page 66 of Orientalism by Saïd, and let's get into it. So, where we stopped last time is Derbello's writings on Islam, which he wrote with a lot of authority, seemingly, but he was incredibly racist about it and disrespectful as well. Because he says, this is the famous impostor Muhammad, author and founder of a heresy which has taken the name of a religion which we call Mohammedan. See entry under Islam. The interpreters and other doctors of Muslim or Mohammedan law have applied to this false prophet all the praises which the Aryans, Paulicians, Paulinists, and other heretics have attributed to Jesus Christ, while stripping him of his divinity. Mohammedan is relevant and insulting as a European designation. Islam, which happens to be the correct Muslim name, is relegated to another entry. And now you have to understand that Edward Said, as a Palestinian man, is often assumed to be, incorrectly, to be Muslim. I mean, you could judge by his name. he, he was not Muslim. In fact, he was raised Christian. And so Saïd himself shows great reverence for the religion of his land. And he goes on to say, well, to speak about Islam as part of the land, as part of, as an integral part of the Middle East. The heresy, which we can call Mohammedan, is caught in the imitation of a Christian imitation of a true religion. Then, the long historical account of Muhammad's life, there below can turn more or less a straight narrative. But is the placing of Muhammad that counts in the bibliothèque. The dangers of freewheeling heresy are removed when it is transformed into ideologically explicit matter for an alphabetical aim. Muhammad no longer roams the Eastern world as threatening, immoral, a debauchee. He sits quietly on his adamantly prominent portion of the Orientalist stage. He is given a genealogy, explanation, even a development, all of which are subsumed under the simple statements prevalent that prevent him from straying elsewhere. So, when Westerners talk about Islam, often they are talking about Muhammad as a man, as not as a prophet. And there, I think, is the first way in which the Orientalists disrespect Islam as a whole, because they reject him as a prophet right from the start, whereas Islam does not reject Jesus, or as Muslims call him, Isa, as a prophet. And it is because of the rejection of Jesus Christ as a divine being, as the Son of God, that Islam is so vilified. And instead of accepting Muhammad as a holy and wise man into the how do I put it? Into the law of Christianity, essentially. It is a complete rejection outright, and there can be no peace or understanding between the two religions. Good night. I love you. You're handsome. And so, when Orientalists reveal Middle Eastern faiths, practices, etc., to the West through their writing, like in the bibliothèque, we see a lot of people's first encounter with Islam. And right from the off, they're getting this distorted view of what Islam is and who Muhammad is, peace be upon him. By writing something to your audience before anybody else can, you can control the narrative. And we see the same with Israel now, because they've had decades to control and to formulate and to hone in on their narrative so well that the Palestinian narrative has a very hard time catching up, even though it is the true story of the Nakba and all of that. Israel has had the stage for far too long, just like Western Orientalists have had the stage for far too long. And they controlled so much of how we see the Middle East, the Far East, South Asia, or what they call the Near East as well, and how we were represented right from the start has been through negative connotations. So we're having to constantly fight those representations. Some images of the Orient as this are images in that they represent or stand for a very large entity, otherwise impossibly diffuse, which they enable one to grasp or see. They are also characters related to such types as the braggarts, misers, or gluttons produced by Theophrastus, La Bruyere, or Selden. Perhaps it is not exactly correct to say that one sees such characters as the Miles Gloriosus or Mohammed the impostor, since the discursive confinement of a character is supposed at best to let one apprehend a generic type without difficulty or ambiguity. De Belotte's character of Mohammed is an image, however, because the false prophet is part of a general theatrical representation called Oriental, whose totality is contained in the Bibliothèque. The claims that this is fact, right from the get-go, is not supported by anything but its own writing. It's the Bible trying to prove itself because the Bible is the Bible. It's wild. And Westerners never accepted Eastern or Middle Eastern representations of itself as true because they were untrustworthy. First-hand accounts of brown people have always been represented as untrustworthy because these are people who don't know anything better, apparently. And so, the white man's word was enough. That's basically what it's saying. The didactic quality of the Orientalist representation cannot be detached from the rest of this performance. And it really is a performance. Because each time the West reproduced images or chose to represent the Orient in any such way, it was a performance of understanding. In a learned work like the Bibliothèque, which was the result of a systemic study and research, the author imposes a disciplinary order on the material that he had worked on. In addition, he wants it made clear to the reader that what the printed page delivers is an ordered, disciplined judgment of the material. What is conveyed by the Bibliothèque is an idea of Orientalism's power and effectiveness, which everywhere remind the reader that henceforth, in order to get the Orient, he must pass through the learned grids and codes provided by the Orientalist himself. And nobody else can make those judgments. Nobody else can make those judgments because what the white man says is right, apparently. Not only is the Orient accommodated to more moral exigencies of Western Christianity, it's also circumscribed by a series of attitudes and judgment that send the Western mind not first to Oriental sources for correction and verification, but rather to Orientalist works. So, in order to prove what I say about the Orient, you must therefore read another white person's work, another Orientalist's work on it to understand it, because the word and the understanding and the lived experience of the brown person is not trustworthy. The only people who are trustworthy, the only things that are trustworthy in this regard is the word of the white man. The Orientalist stage, as I've been calling it, becomes a system of moral and epistemological rigor. As a discipline representing institutionalized Western knowledge of the Orient, Orientalism thus comes to exert a three-way force on the Orient, on the Orientalist, and on the Western consumer of it. It would be wrong, I think, to underestimate the strength of this three-way relationship thus established. For the Orient, out there toward the East, is corrected, even penalized for lying outside the boundaries of European society or our world. The Orient is thus Orientalized. It's always looked on as third party kind of thing. Or the fourth wall, if you must continue the metaphor suggested by Saïd. A process that not only marks the Orient as a province of the Orientalist, but forces the initiated Western reader to accept codifications, like Debelot's alphabetized bibliothèque, as true. Truth, in short, becomes a function of learned judgment, not the material itself, which in time seems to owe even its existence to the writer or the Orientalist. And so, how many of you have learnt about a certain part of the world through a Western lens, and then found that actually that's not fucking true at all? As soon as you hear from the people who actually live there, or the people who have lived experience, yeah, Taylor, like when people hear me say that the white genocide that is supposedly going on in South Africa isn't real, they're like, no, but that's what everybody says. Who is everybody? People in the West. That's what people in the West say. This whole didactic process is neither difficult to understand nor difficult to explain. One ought again to remember that all cultures impose corrections upon raw reality, changing it from free-floating objects into units of knowledge. Putting something into a box never bodes well for the actual true knowledge of it. The problem is not the conversion that takes place. It's perfectly natural for the human mind to resist the assault of unrelented strangeness. Therefore, cultures have always been inclined to impose complete transformations on other cultures, receiving these other cultures not as they are, but for the benefit of the receiver, like they ought to be. When people talk about Hinduism, they're like, "Oh, the many gods." No. There's not many gods. There's deities, and actually, Hindus only believe in one god, and he has 3 facets to him or them, as it is in some texts. People don't want to hear that because throughout their lives they've been told that there are many gods in Hinduism. What doesn't make sense, Mark? I can explain it further. To the Westerner, the Oriental was always like some aspect of the West. To some of the German Romantics, for example, Indian religion was essentially an Oriental version of Germano-Christian pantheism. That's where it comes from. The idea that there are multiple gods. What about multiple gods? Please elaborate. What is it that doesn't make sense? Yet the Orientalist makes it work to be always converting the Orient for something into something else. Like I explained last week, Rabindranath Tagore, as an Indian writer, is said to be India's Shakespeare, or the Indian Shakespeare. No, he's Rabindranath Tagore. He is nothing like Shakespeare. So why is it that the Orientalist mind always has to relate it to something Western in order to perceive it? And always less than. Always less than. He does it for himself, for the sake of his culture, in some cases, what he believes, the sake of the Orient. This process of conversion is a disciplined one, taught, has its own societies, periodicals, traditions, vocabulary, rhetoric, all basic in the ways connected to and supplied by prevailing cultural and political norms of the West. It is always done through a Western lens. And as I shall demonstrate, it tends to become more rather than less, total in what it tries to do, so much so that as one surveys Orientalism in the 19th and 20th centuries, the overriding impression is of Orientalism's insensitive schematization of the entire Orient. American education system indoctrinates its student from an early age to believe the narrative they push. Yeah, absolutely. It starts with the reciting of the The Pledge of Allegiance. Every day at school. It's nationalism in training. How early the schematization begins is clear from the examples I've given of Western representations of the Orient in classical Greece. How strongly articulated were later representations building on earlier ones, how inordinately careful their schematization, how dramatically effective their placing in Western imaginative geography can be illustrated, if we turn now to Dante's Inferno. Now, this is one of my favorite things. Dante's Inferno is one of the greatest pieces of literature I have ever consumed from the West. Mark, you are not making sense. What is it you are asking? What is it that does not make sense to you? Because which god shares roles? What are you asking? Dante's achievement in the Divine Comedy was to have seamlessly combined the realistic portrayal of mundane reality with universal and eternal systems of Christian values. What Dante the pilgrim sees as he walks through the Inferno, purgatory, and paradise is a unique version of judgment. Paolo and Francesca, for instance, are seen as eternally confined to hell for their sins, yet they are seen as enacting, indeed living, the very characters and actions that put them where they are and where they will be for eternity. Thus, each of the figures in Dante's vision not only represents himself, but also a typical representation of his character and the fate meted out to him. Muhammad turns up in Canto 28 of Inferno. He is located in the 8th of the 9 circles of hell, the 9th of the 10 logias of, I can't say that word, a circle of gloomy ditches surrounding Satan's stronghold in hell. Thus, before Dante reaches Muhammad, he passes through the circles containing people whose sins are of a lesser order: lustful, avaricious, gluttonous, heretics, wrathful, suicidal, and blasphemous. After Muhammad, peace be upon him, there are only falsifiers and treacherous, who include Judas, Brutus, and Cassius, before one arrives at the very bottom of hell, where Satan himself is to be found. Muhammad thus belongs to a rigid hierarchy of evils, in the category of what Dante calls seminator di scandalo e schisma. Muhammad's punishment, which is also his eternal fate, is a particularly disgusting one. He is endlessly being cleft in two from his chin to his anus, like Dante says, a cask whose staves are ripped apart. Dante's verse at this point spares the reader none of the detail, so vivid a punishment entails. Muhammad's entrails and excrement are described with unflinching accuracy. Muhammad explains his punishment to Dante, pointing well to Ali, who presents him in the line of sinners, whom the attendant devil is splitting in two. He also asks Dante to warn Fra Dolcino, a renegade priest whose sect advocated community of women and gods, and who was accused of having a mistress, and what will be in store for him. It would have not been lost on the reader that Dante saw a parallel between Dolcino and Muhammad's revolting sensuality, and also between their pretensions and theological eminence. I mean, when you look at Dante and the reality in which he is writing, you get a general sense that he is reading and understanding Islam through texts like the Bibliothèque. He is understanding Muhammad, peace be upon him, through the understanding of Western imperialists. And you cannot divide those two. You cannot distinguish the representation of Muhammad as a sinner, as as an infidel, as what's the word that he used? An imposter, a false prophet. You cannot separate Dante's understanding and representation of the prophet unless you understand, well, without understanding De Bellot's work. If you have any questions, let me know. Because it is through this kind of theology that we understand, essentially, okay, let me give you an example. When I was in my final year of my degree, I picked a topic out of a hat and to write a feminist critique of it. This was all the way back in 2004. I did not have the understanding that I have now of Islam. And I wrote a paper on how Muslim women are complicit in their own oppression. Because my entire understanding of Islam and of women's rights in Islam were perceived through a Western lens. If I could go back and rewrite that essay, I wouldn't write it. This is not all that Dante has to say about Islam. Earlier in the Inferno, a small group of Muslims turn up. Avicenna, Averroes, and Saladin are among these virtuous heathens who, along with Hector, Athene, Ennius, Abraham, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, are confined to the first circle of the Inferno, there to suffer minimal and even honorable punishment for not having the kind of benefit of Christian revelation. Dante, of course, admires their great virtues and accomplishments, but because they were not Christians, he must condemn them, however likely, to hell. Eternity is a great leveler of distinctions, it is true, but the special anachronisms and anomalies of putting pre-Christian luminaries in the same category of heathen damnation with post-Christian Muslims does not trouble Dante. Even though the Quran specifies Jesus as a prophet, Dante chooses to consider the great Muslim philosophers and kings as having being fundamentally ignorant of Christianity. That they can also inhabit the same distinguished level as heroes and sages of classical antiquity is a historical vision similar to Raphael's in his fresco, The School of Athens, in which Averroes scrubs elbows on the academy floor with Socrates and Plato. Similar to Dialogue des Morts in 1700, where a discussion takes place between Socrates and Confucius. Absolutely ahistorical, but fascinating nonetheless. I wrote a piece. I actually need to, properly flesh it out now. A conversation between basically on H.P. Lovecraft's deathbed. He greets death. And this conversation with death about him being such a horrible person throughout his life. And then the very people that he hurt in his life. The very people that he damned in his books, all of the people who he wrote horridly about, drag him into the underworld through his fireplace. Yeah, I actually want to flesh it out as a full short story. Any questions? I digress. The discriminations and refinements of Dante's poetic grasp of Islam are an instance of schematic, almost cosmological inevitability, with which Islam and its designated representatives are creatures of Western geographical, historical, and above all, moral apprehension. Empirical data about the Orient or anything about it, its parts, count for very little. What matters and is decisive is what I have been calling the Orientalist vision. A vision by no means confined to a professional scholar, but rather the common possession of all who have thought about the Orient in the West. Dante's powers as a poet intensify, make more rather or less representative these perspectives on the Orient. Muhammad, Saladin, Averroes, and Avicenna are fixed in a visionary cosmology, fixed, laid out, boxed in, imprisoned, without much regard for anything except their function in the patterns they realize on stage in which they appear. Isaiah Berlin has described the effect of such attitudes in the following way. In such a cosmology, the world of men, and in some versions an entire universe, is a single inclusive hierarchy, so that to explain why each object is as it is, and where and when it is, and what it does, is ipso to say what the goal is, how far it successfully fulfills that role, and what are the relations of coordination and subordination between the goals and the various goal-pursuing entities in this harmonious pyramid which they collectively form. It is a true picture of reality, then, historical explanation. Like every other form of explanation, it must consist above all of the attribution of individuals, groups, nations, species, each to its own proper place in the universal pattern that is decided by white supremacy. To know the cosmic place of a thing or a person is to say what it is and what it does, and at the same time why it should be and do as it is and does. Hence, to be and have value, to exist and have function, and to fulfill it more or less successfully are one and the same. The pattern and it alone brings it into being and causes to pass away and confers purpose, that is to say, value and meaning, on all there is. To understand is to perceive patterns. The more inevitable an event or an action or a character can be exhibited as being, the better it has to be understood, the profounder the researcher's insight, the nearer we are to one ultimate truth, and this attitude is profoundly anti-empirical. Anti-empirical, not anti-empirical, because it is imperialism. Anti-empirical as in anti-knowledge. Anti-evidence, really. And so, indeed it is, that the Orientalist attitude in general shares with magic, with mythology, the self-containing, self-reinforcing character of a closed system, in which objects are the way they are because they are what they are, for once, for all, for ontological reasons that no empirical material can either dislodge or alter. The European encounter with the Orient, and specifically with the likes of Islam, strengthened the system of representing the Orient and has been suggested by Henri Brienne, turned Islam to the epitome of an outsider against the whole of European civilization from the Middle Ages on. The decline of the Roman Empire, as a result of the quote-unquote barbarian invasions, had the paradoxical effect of incorporating barbarian ways into Roman and Mediterranean culture. Romania, whereas Brienne argues, the consequence of Islamic invasions began in the 7th century was to move the center of European culture away from the Mediterranean, which was then an Arab province, and towards the north. Germanism began to play its part in history. Hitherto the Roman tradition had been interrupted. Now an original Romano-Germanic civilization was about to develop. Europe was shut in on itself. The Orient, when it was not merely a place in which one traded, was culturally, intellectually, spiritually outside Europe and European civilization, in which, in Perrin's words, became one great Christian community, coterminous with the ecclesia. The Occident was now living its own life. Thank you for the follow. In Dante's poem, the work of Peter the Venerable and other Cluniac Orientalists in the writings of the Christian polemicists against Islam, from Gilbert of Nogent and Bede to Roger Bacon, William of Tripoli, Boucard of Marcion, and Luther. In the Poema de Cid, the Chanson de Roland, and Shakespeare's Othello, that abuser of the world, the Orient in Islam is always represented as outsiders having a special role to play within Europe. Basically, the Hollywood tradition of using women as conduits for men's actions, of using the brown person as a conduit for white action, it started here. It started by using everything outside of Europe as a conduit for European action, for European existence, for European being. Because Europe has so little imagination that it had to define itself by what it is not, rather than by what it is. Imaginative geography, from the vivid portraits to be found in the Inferno to the prosaic niches of Dermelot's bibliothèque, legitimates a vocabulary, a universe of representative discourse, peculiar to the discussion and understanding of Islam and of the Orient. What this discourse considers to be a fact, that Muhammad is an impostor, for example, is a component of discourse, a statement of discourse that compels one to make whenever the name of Muhammad occurs. Underlying all the different units of Orientalist discourse, by which I mean simply vocabulary employed whenever the Orient is spoken of, is a set of representative figures or tropes. The figures are to the actual Orient or Islam, which is my main concern here, as stylized costumes are to characters in a play. For example, the cross that every man will carry, or the parti-colored costume worn by Harlequina in a Commedia dell'arte. In other words, we need not look for correspondence between the language used to depict the Orient and the Orient itself. Not so much because the language is inaccurate, because it's not even trying to be accurate. What it is trying to do, as Dante tries in the Inferno, is one and the same: to characterize the Orient as alien, to incorporate it schematically on the theatrical stage whose audience, manager, and actors are for Europe, and only for Europe. Characterize. That is exactly what the West does to every single culture it comes across. Make a caricature of, poke fun at, devalue. If they cannot consume it, discard it. Thank you. Hence the vacillation between familiar and alien. Muhammad, peace be upon him, is always the impostor. Familiar because he pretends to be like the Jesus they know. And always the Oriental, alien, because although he is in some ways like Jesus, he is after all not so much like him. Rather than listing all the figures of speech associated with the Orient, strangeness, difference, exotic sensuousness, and so forth, we can generalize about them as they were handed down through the Renaissance. They are all declarative, self-evident, and tense. They employ this timeless eternal, convey an impression of repetition and strength, always symmetrical and yet diametrically inferior to a European equivalent. That's what I was saying earlier about the writers. Why is it that the writers are this India's version of Shakespeare or Africa's version of Socrates? Because it is always comparative to, representative of, and equally inferior to. Thus, Muhammad is an impostor. The phrase canonized in bibliothèque, dramatized by Dante. No background need be given. The evidence necessary to convict Muhammad is contained in is. Because a white man says it is. One does not qualify the phrase, neither does it seem necessary to say that Muhammad was an impostor, nor need one consider for a moment that it may not be necessary to repeat the statement. It is, he is, and each time someone says it, he becomes more of an impostor. And the author of the statement gains a little more authority in having declared it. Prédiau's famous 17th century biography of Muhammad, peace be upon him, is subtitled The True Nature of Imposture. Finally, of course, such categories as impostor, or Oriental for that matter, imply, indeed require, an opposite that is neither fraudulently something else nor endlessly in need of explicit identification. And that opposite is Occidental, or in Muhammad's case, Jesus. Philosophically, then, the kind of language, thought, and vision that I've been calling Orientalism is a form of radical realism. Anyone employing it, which is the habit of dealing with questions, objects, qualities, and religions deemed Oriental, would designate, name, point to, fix what he is talking or thinking about with a word or phrase, which is then considered either to have acquired or more simply to be reality. Rhetorically speaking, it's an absolute anatomical and enumerative to use vocabulary, engaging in particularizing and dividing Orientals into manageable parts. Psychologically, Orientalism is a form of paranoia, knowledge of another kind, say, from ordinary historical knowledge. These are few of the results, I think, of imaginative geography of the dramatic boundaries it draws. There are some specifically modern transmutations of these Orientalized results, however, to which I must now turn. And that is the end of section 2 of chapter 1, which looks at the scope. Now, because he spoke about Dante's Inferno, we must read Dante's Inferno. If I can find it. I swear I had it here. Oh wait, I do not have it here because I lent it to someone in Pretoria. I lent it to someone. Okay, we are looking at Canto 28. No tongue so vast a theme could equal speech and thought, both impotent alike. If in one band collected stood all the people who ever poured on Apulia's happy soil their blood slain by the Trojans in that long war, when of the rings the measured booty, yes, booty, made a pile so high, as Rome's historian writes, who errs not with the great multitude that felt the grinding force of Guiscard's Norman steel. And those, the rest whose bones are gathered yet, where there was treachery, branded the Apulian name, or where beyond the walls of Tagliacozzo with arms and the old Eldaro conquered, and his limbs were one showed transpired and the other clean opt away. A spectacle like this were a thing of naught to the hideous sight of the ninth chasm, a rundlet that had lost its middle or side stave, gapes not so wide as one I marked from chin throughout down to the hinder passage, twixt the legs, dangling his entrails hung, the midriff lay open to view, the wretched ventricle that turns gluttoned alignment to dross. Whilst I eagerly fixed him on my gaze, he eyed me with his hands, laid his breast bare, and cried, "Now mark how I do rip me. How is Muhammad mangled before me, walks Ali weeping. From the chin his face cleft to the forelock, and the others all whom here thou seest, while they lived did sow scandal and schism, and therefore thus are rent. A fiend here is behind, who the swords hacked thus cruelly, silvering again each of his ream when we have compassed aground. The dismal way for our first gashes close, ere we repass before him. But say, who art thou, that standest musing on the rock, haply so lingering to delay pain, sentenced upon thy crimes? Him death not yet, my guide rejoined, hath overtaken, nor sin conducts to torment, but make full trial of your state. I who am dead, must through the depths of hell from orb to orb conduct him. Trust my words, for they are true." Yeah, graphic. This would have been normal to represent any person they thought as a false prophet in this way. And as much as it is a brilliant poem, and I love it, especially story of Piero and Francesca. It does not come without its criticisms. So it is there I must end today, and please don't forget, I have a TikTok at The Unscripted Revolution. It is the name for all of my stuff. I'm so sorry, Taro. Is it better now? So yes, I have a TikTok, The Unscripted Revolution, Nikki Starfish on Twitch, The Unscripted Revolution on YouTube, and please, if you can afford to, you can subscribe to my Patreon, The Unscripted Revolution, for $1, $5, $10, or $20 a month, depending on the tier that you choose. You can join Patreon. You can donate through PayPal or Coffee if you appreciate these readings, if you're benefiting from them. And yeah, I do this work mostly for free and for the love of it. So let me know, etc., etc. And yeah, join my Discord, because I put news and stuff in there, and I put readings and books and stuff. So yeah, enjoy your evening. I hope you dream of your favorite dinosaur when you finally do fall asleep. Remember to drink water, take your meds, eat something. Smash the motherfucking patriarchy, eat all the white men, and remember to be kind, especially to yourselves, because everybody deserves kindness, including you, contrary to what you might think about yourself. I know things are hard, times are hard, and I shall see you tomorrow, same time, different book, same place. Just hang in there.